Nice going, Senate Republicans. Real nice going. That was a whole lot of nothing. What in the hell was the point of so strenuously opposing the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the U.S. Supreme Court? They just voted to confirm her, as they were always more or less guaranteed to do. And all Republicans in the Senate have really accomplished is to remind certain swaths of the electorate of why they dislike, even detest, the Republican Party so much in the first place. What's more, they've just completely wasted a whole lot of energy and time that could have been better allocated to other purposes. At the end of the day, because soon to be Justice Jackson will be replacing outgoing current Associate Justice Stephen Breyer, who was also a firm member in good standing of the Supreme Court's liberal wing, this is not going to change the ideological balance of power on the Supreme Court. Even once Justice Jackson is confirmed to the Supreme Court, guess what? The conservatives on the court are still going to have a 6-3 majority anyway. So what's the point? What was the point of so stridently opposing her nomination, and on such spurious, flimsy, and frequently dishonest grounds, trying to claim that she was some kind of apologist for pedophilia and all that disgusting nonsense? Give me a break. Give me a break. It's just absurd. And, I think this points us to a larger issue in American politics, arguably in politics in general, and particularly when it comes to issues of U.S. Supreme Court politics. I think that there is a certain amount of hypocrisy that is probably unavoidable in the political game overall. I think there are structural reasons for that. I think that one of the reasons so many politicians practice the opposite of what they preach or flip-flop over the years, etc., is because they have different constituencies to try to keep happy, often at the same time. And in order to do that, they have to equivocate and dissemble and prevaricate and often outright lie. And they often have to contradict themselves and do one thing in one context and then do the exact opposite thing when the partisan political shoe is on the other foot, etc., etc. However, I do not believe that the game of politics has to be as hypocritical as it is. I don't think this is necessary. When it comes to the Republicans and their stance on Justice Brown Jackson's nomination, I could have understood them ferociously opposing her nomination if she had been replacing, say, any of the conservative justices on the court. None of them would ever have retired with a Democrat in the White House. That will never happen. No conservative judge on the court will ever retire with a Democrat in the White House. Even some of the more moderate-leaning conservative judges on the court, like Anthony Kennedy, made sure to wait until a Republican president was in the White House before retiring. He's the one who paved the way for Brett Kavanaugh to take his seat on the court back in 2018. But at the same time, by the same token, no liberal judge on the court is ever going to retire willingly while there's a Republican in the White House. They want to be replaced by presidents from their own political worldviews who will almost certainly replace them with new justices who will carry on their legacies. Makes sense. But when it comes to the question of Justice Brown Jackson, soon to be Justice Brown Jackson, being confirmed to the court, if she had been appointed to replace a Republican or a conservative Supreme Court justice, right? If, say, Clarence Thomas had passed away and Joe Biden had an opportunity to appoint her as his replacement, then it would have made sense for the Republicans to be all up in arms about it. Why? Because replacing one of the conservatives on the court with a liberal would have shifted the overall aggregate ideological balance of the Supreme Court further to the left. That is exactly why, for example, in 2016, under Mitch McConnell's leadership, the Senate Republicans refused even to hold a vote or hearings on Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court by President Obama. It wasn't because of that nonsense that they spouted at the time, that transparently cynical, dishonest, insincere, hypocritical nonsense about let the American people have their say. It's an election year. Obama's a lame duck. He shouldn't get to appoint any more Supreme Court justices, even though he's elected to a 4-year term, and he was reelected to a second 4-year term in 2012 by the American people, a majority of the American people, unlike Trump. And he gets to wield all of the powers of the presidency for an entire 4 years, not just for 3. But anyway, there was no need for the Republicans to engage in that absurd posturing. What I think they should have said was, look, we have our preferred vision of how the U.S. Constitution in particular, law in general, and the Constitution in particular, should be interpreted and applied. We have our own philosophy of legal and constitutional interpretation. We believe that our preferred philosophy, call it originalism, call it textualism, forgive me, call it strict constructionism, whatever you want to call it, we have our own philosophy of legal and constitutional interpretation, and we believe that approach to interpreting and applying the laws of the land is the best approach for the country. Any Democratic nominee to the Supreme Court will not share that philosophy and would only undermine it once they're confirmed to the bench. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if a liberal nominee is replacing an outgoing liberal justice or a liberal justice who's just died. But if they're replacing a conservative one, and especially an iconic conservative one like Antonin Scalia, that would shift the overall balance of the Supreme Court further to the left, even only slightly. Obama knew that since he was a lame duck in 2016 and the Republicans controlled the Senate, it would be like pulling teeth to get them to go along with any Supreme Court nominee that he sent their way. That's why he tried to meet them halfway by giving them a white man who was reputed to be a relative moderate in the federal judiciary, namely Judge Garland. It still didn't work. But instead of spouting that BS and refusing to even hold hearings, let alone an up or down vote on Garland's nomination, like Mitch McConnell and the Republicans did, instead what they should have simply said was, look, we are not going to allow a Democratic president, especially in his last year in office, to appoint a replacement for a conservative Supreme Court justice, because that would shift the court further away in the aggregate from our preferred approach to interpreting and applying the laws of the land. And that is why we're just not going to allow President Obama to appoint Justice Scalia's replacement. Now, I still think the right thing to do would have been to hold hearings, hold a vote, and whip your whole party into shape and make sure that as many Republicans in the Senate as possible vote against this nominee. I think the reason why Mitch McConnell didn't go that route is because he figured he couldn't take any chances. He couldn't risk. Party discipline in the U.S. is much weaker than in other countries like my native Canada. So he felt he probably couldn't risk allowing any of his fellow Republicans in the Senate to go off script or run off half-cocked and vote to confirm Merrick Garland or any other Obama nominee to replace Justice Scalia. So he figures, you know what? Let's just not hold hearings or vote at all, and pray that whoever our party nominates for president this summer will win the election in November. And of course, that's what Trump ultimately went on to do, against all odds. But at the end of the day, the least McConnell should have done and could have done was level with the American people about his genuine motive for thwarting Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court. I don't think they went about it the right way, but I also specifically don't think that they were as honest as they could and should have been with the American people about their real motive for doing what they did. So in this case, hello, you have a liberal president replacing an outgoing, retiring liberal Supreme Court justice with a new liberal judge. And of course, he's already promised to appoint a black woman, and now he's nominated one. She'll be the first black woman on the Supreme Court in its entire history, and yet y'all still want to make a big friggin' stink about this nomination and try to sling as much mud at her as you can, even though a bunch of y'all, such as Lindsey Graham, already voted to confirm her to lower federal courts just a few years ago. What sense does that make? What do you even gain out of it? Aside from the fact that y'all don't have the numbers in the Senate to block her nomination effectively anyway, you're also putting yourselves in a position where, once again, the Democrats will be able to accuse you of racism, dog whistle racism, rightly or wrongly, rightly in my view. But anyway, I don't expect Republicans, most of them at least, to agree with that accusation, but at the end of the day, you are giving that ammunition to your opposing party. So just from a purely strategic standpoint, what is the use of trying to fight that battle? Why die on that hill? You get nothing out of it. You don't have the numbers in Congress to make good on your attempts to block her nomination anyway. You had the numbers in 2016 to block Merrick Garland. You don't have the numbers in 2022 to block Ketanji Brown Jackson. And given that she's the first black woman ever on the Supreme Court, somehow you guys want to use that against her? You want to talk about, we're going to condemn Joe Biden for promising to appoint a black woman in the first place. It's an affirmative action hire and all this other ghastly dog whistle racist foolishness. It's just absurd. And the party gained nothing from this except perhaps to gin up and rile up their base a little bit, which they were probably already going to be able to do anyway, just using any number of other issues that are already on the table, from inflation to Trump's stop the steal nonsense and the continuation of that whole big lie. I don't know that they needed to pull this stunt in order to keep ginning up votes from their base. Just the whole fiasco of the 2020 election and Trump's insistence that it was somehow stolen from him, which is completely bogus. That alone, I think, has provided more than enough motivation for the Republican base to turn out to vote, not only next November, but 2 Novembers after that too, in 2024. When, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, there may very well be a rematch between Trump and Joe Biden. Knock wood, God forbid, but time will tell. This is just textbook political stupidity on the Republicans' part. Textbook political stupidity. It gained them nothing, at least nothing that they weren't already able to gain through other means. They weren't able to make good on it because they didn't have the political strength to do it. They've opened themselves up just a little bit more to many of the same accusations of bigotry that Democrats have been leveling at Republicans for decades. But in this case, the shoe fits. And there's plenty of other cases where the shoe fits as well. And at the end of the day, they're doing all of this for what? To prevent a liberal president from nominating a liberal judge to replace a liberal judge, which will still leave a 6-3 conservative majority on the court anyway. That is the one fact that just makes this whole thing completely absurd. Just an absolute waste of time on the Republicans' part. And by extension, a waste of all Americans' time. A waste of the American people's time. A waste of taxpayers' time. A waste of the U.S. Senate's time. And I'm very disappointed in certain relatively moderate, or at least sane, conservative Republican senators like Ben Sasse voting no on Judge Brown Jackson's nomination. I get that you have conservative views as well as a conservative philosophy of constitutional interpretation. Interestingly enough, during the hearings, Justice Brown Jackson actually disavowed the idea of living constitutionalism, the idea that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that spontaneously metamorphosizes over time to keep pace with the changing times, which is an idea I myself have never bought into. And she actually said, no, I think the meaning of the Constitution's terms is fixed unless it's ever changed by, I guess the implication was that unless you change it via constitutional amendment, the meaning of the document doesn't just spontaneously change. Now, I tend to agree with that statement on its face, but, and it actually pleased a lot of the conservative critics of Judge Brown Jackson who were listening to those hearings and listening to that segment. But ultimately, it remains to be seen whether she ends up ruling that way once she's on the court. Time will tell. Personally, I doubt it. But that aside, the bottom line is she wouldn't have changed the overall ideological orientation of the court. She's not going to change it. So what do you really gain, Ben Sasse and others like you, from voting against her nomination? What does it accomplish? In addition, when you combine that with the fact that y'all don't have the numbers in the Senate to block her nomination effectively anyway, what was the point of all of that? And now, you, as one of the dwindling number of Republicans who can command even the slightest shred of respect from people on the other side of the aisle, now you've put yourself in a position where more and more Democrats are going to say, oh, well, we don't want to work with him either. He voted no on Judge Brown Jackson's nomination to the Supreme Court, so he's just like all the rest of them, just like all the rest of those Republicans. This is a Republican senator I have respected in the past. But not that this changes everything, at least in my book, but at the same time, it's extremely disappointing. I think it's a stupid political move on his part. I can only assume that he did this to try to keep his base, his constituents, in his corner back in his home state of Nebraska. I don't know how Trumpy a state Nebraska is, but ultimately it is a conservative state. And sure, yeah, I'm sure they wouldn't be crazy about Judge Brown Jackson's confirmation to the Supreme Court, but this is where someone in his position ought to go back to his constituents and practice some leadership politics, some conviction politics. Instead of simply blowing with the prevailing winds of public opinion in your home constituency, go back to your jurisdiction, in this case the state of Nebraska, and break it down for the people. Explain to your voters, especially those who may be upset with you for voting to confirm someone like Justice Brown Jackson, and tell them, look, if she had been appointed to replace a conservative justice on the Supreme Court, such as Clarence Thomas. If Justice Thomas had, knock wood, God forbid, if he had hypothetically passed away the way Justice Scalia did in 2016, and Joe Biden had nominated Judge Brown Jackson, or any other liberal judge for that matter, to replace a justice like Clarence Thomas, then I would have voted no on her nomination, or the nomination of any other Democratic president, because look, a Democratic president is always going to nominate an at least left-leaning judge to the Supreme Court. Just like a Republican president will always nominate a judge who at least leans right to the Supreme Court. So explain to your Nebraskan constituents that you would have voted no on her nomination if the stakes had been higher, if her nomination to the court threatened to upset the political balance of power on the Supreme Court and endanger your conservative, originalist, strict constructionist philosophy of constitutional and legal interpretation. But that wasn't the case here. So go back and tell your constituents, I voted to confirm her because this was an important symbolic appointment. It's important for us to acknowledge, for us to have the first black woman on the Supreme Court. It's important for us to demonstrate that we are an inclusive, racially egalitarian society, or at least that we strive to be one anyway. It's important for us as Republicans to show that we are not the racist ogres that Democrats portray us to be. And since Judge Brown Jackson's nomination did not threaten the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, we had to keep our powder dry for other fights. You got to pick your fights in politics, as in so many other endeavors in life, so many other competitive endeavors in life. So that, I think, is how someone in Ben Sass's position should have played it. But instead he chose to just sell out is probably not the right term, but to just blow and bend with the blowing winds of his base, basically, to just kowtow to his base. And I think that is really, really unfortunate, because I always say Trump has brought out the worst in people across the whole political spectrum ever since he first ran for president. And particularly on the right, there's just a ever dwindling number of Republicans who can still command the respect of someone like myself, let alone all the millions of Americans who are just firmly left-wing in their views, right? And to have someone like Senator Sass cast a vote like this under these circumstances is really disappointing, because it just threatens to add to the polarization in the country. It's going to be that much harder now to get any Democrats to admit that there are any Republicans out there who are worth working with, who are worth compromising with, who are willing to just put their heads together and reach across the aisle to work with the Democrats to govern the country, to govern in the best interests of the country, and to help preserve American democracy from the assaults on it coming from the Trump personality cult. So that really sucks of you. That's really sucky of you, Senator Sass. Very disappointed in you and all of the other supposedly sane, level-headed Republican senators who really ought to have known better. I will say, though, kudos to Senator Mitt Romney, who I understand voted to confirm soon-to-be Justice Jackson to the Supreme Court, and I think a few others. I want to say Lisa Murkowski of Alaska might be one of them, but I'm not 100% sure. Don't quote me on that yet. And from what I was looking at just now, it sounded like they had to wait briefly until they could find out whether I think Rand Paul abstained at first, or because it was a roll call vote, and at first he didn't vote when they called his name or something like that. So I was actually surprised. I expected Rand Paul to just boldly say no, vote no. I didn't expect him to show any kind of, even that he was considering voting in a sensible manner. But I guess, hey, people surprise you sometimes. We'll see. I'll have to double check and see whether he ultimately cast his vote. I think he might have. They only just cast the whole vote just now, a few minutes ago. But we shall see. But ultimately, man, Republicans, y'all really crapped the bed on this one. You did not need to do this. You did not need to stoop this low. You didn't need to vote against this nomination under these circumstances. If the court had been split 5-4, maybe I could have seen it, although even then, not really. But it would have been a more plausible, there would have been a more colorable case to make in favor of, voting down or voting against this nomination. If, again, I can't stress this enough, if a conservative justice had died or retired, they wouldn't have retired with a Democrat in the White House, though. So if a conservative justice had died, I can see saying, we're going to vote against anybody the Democrats nominate. But under these circumstances, this was just dumb. Dumb.